Hello and welcome to revision tips for SIPS Level 6 Professional Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 1 Strategic Ethical Leadership, and we're focusing on Learning Outcome 2, which is to understand and apply communication planning techniques and analyse their influence on individuals involved in the supply chain. So this chapter is about communication, and we know that plays an important part in the effectiveness of leaders, managers and organisation. And when communication is not effective, it can be a cause of many problems. So we're going to look at implementing a vision for the improved procurement and supply chain management through effective communication. And what we're looking at here are influencing styles, and there are different influencing styles with varying names. I guess what this is all about is the fact that leaders and managers will need to be able to influence people within their organisation and across the entire supply chain. So that could be people from different cultures, different functions, where the supply chain is global, and even different time zones. So some of the styles they can use is assertive or reasoning. This style uses logic and reasoning, and facts are used to indicate that their request from the leader or manager is necessary and will be beneficial. The leader will use logic and reasoning when they have established credibility and there is a common ground across everyone involved. Convincing or reasoning. This is still a reasoning style where the leader uses facts and logic, but the leader uses a more persuasive rather than commanding way of putting forward their ideas to convince others to undertake their request. Consulting is a style used when the leader has identified the experience the individuals have and then asks them to suggest solutions or improvements or help in planning the proposals. So a leader will use this style when they want individuals to own the project. A leader may lack experience and therefore also need the expertise of those individuals. Collaborating or bridging is a style that a leader could use when they collaborate with others, providing resources in order to help them undertake the request. In this style, the leader wants to minimize the difficulty that the individual might have in carrying out their request. This may also be a bridging style where the leader attempts to influence outcomes by connecting with the others in the group. They may use personal relationships to get others in the group to agree to their positions. Inspiring is a style that's used to the beliefs, emotions, and values of the others. The leader will inspire by encouraging and communicating a shared sense of purpose. The leader tells the others that by carrying out their requests, it will benefit others. So revolutionizing a way of doing something that maybe benefits the suppliers. And finally, negotiating. A leader who uses bargaining is sometimes prepared to find a compromise and uses other persuasion tools to reach out and reach an outcome with other parties. So if leaders and managers want to be better leaders and implement an improved vision of procurement, they will need to increase how they'll influence others. Which leads us on to the importance of active listening. To become active listeners, leaders and managers must learn a few methods. Firstly, be open-minded. Don't assume knowledge of the other person, influencing styles or problems or solutions. Listen carefully to what's being said, to the words and the tone of the voice. Look for non-verbal cues like eye contact and body language, and ask questions to find out concerns of others and clarify the points. Third, take notes. Write down and make mental notes of important points about what was said in a way that, I guess it's said, it will help to identify the influencing style used by that person. And then respond with an influencing style appropriate to the situation. Try to match the communication and influencing style to those or others in the group. Be aware that the influencing style may change during the conversation process. Now, procurement leaders need to understand that influence is not just about having charisma although some leaders may have charisma. A leader's individual influence can be increased by realizing that it's about being able to adapt their style in different situations and when working with different people. Now, leading, managing, and influencing in 4 different directions can be viewed using north, east, south, east, and west. The directions refer to others that you manage within examples such as upwardly, you could be managing senior managers, so you're managing north. Downwardly, managing staff in the southern direction. And across, managing functional managers and stakeholders within your organisation, which is east. And then managing across the supply chain is west. So these directions have been adapted from a framework developed by project managers. And it's all about leading and influencing in 4 directions. It's viewed that managing upwards as reporting to more senior persons and managing downwards to staff and users. And managing across could go to stakeholders or to the supply chain. But this framework is useful for leaders and managers who can use it to identify which stakeholders they need to influence, what communication and influencing style they need to use, and what individuals may need to build that strong and positive relationship with. Now, traditionally, organisations are vertical structures where the organisation was divided into departments according to their functions, like finance and procurement and sales and marketing. But the matrix structure emerged in the 1970s, and although it's still a vertical hierarchy, there is also a horizontal element. So in the matrix structure, there is more than one line manager. In effect, it means the employees have a line manager in their functional level, but they also have a project manager in the horizontal level. So a matrix structure is an organisation where there are two-way flows of authority and responsibility due to vertical flow and horizontal flow. There is more than one line of reporting managers. So what's the advantages of this? The advantages is that you do increase cooperation, communication, and accessibility to the resources across the organisation. You can manage supply chains outside and integrate your functions, reflecting on the importance of the goals and local businesses, responding quickly to changes, and developing individual employees as they have broader views and skills which add value across the business. But the downside is the lack of accountability to the roles, slower decision making, because there's more people involved, increased bureaucracy, and more uncertainty and conflict. So moving on to authority, influence and power. In an organisational setting, it is important to understand the difference between authority, influence and power. So authority is given to an individual to achieve an organisational objective. It is right to make the decision and the right to give orders to the subordinates and get them to comply. However, managers can manage and influence without authority. It's an important part when you're discussing managing in 4 directions. Influence is the key skill that effective leaders and managers have. It's the ability to influence others in a way that will help them to follow and act willingly. Whereas power is the ability of an individual to influence the actions and beliefs of others. And it's important to understand where power comes from in the workplace. According to French and Raven, there are different types of power. You've got personal power, the power that an individual has because of their personality. Maybe some expert power due to expertise, like a doctor or an engineer. Informational power is where an individual has information that nobody else has. Legitimate power is, someone's position or office that's held within an organisation, like a chairman. This individual, when they leave the organisation, the power doesn't necessarily go with them. It's just switched to somebody else. Coercive power is when individuals use threat and bullying as a way to get others to do things against their will. This type of power is used in some organisations, but it's the least effective It leads to fear, resentment, and dissatisfaction. Reward power, where an individual gets others to do something by offering a reward. So, for example, if they do this, they will get that. It can be a reward perceived of having value, a gift card, or something like that. A trophy, maybe, to the highest performer. And referent power is sometimes known as respect power. This is where the individual attracts others and builds a loyal following. Some perceive this as being innate. So an individual is born with it. It's not learnt. When a leader is well known for their success, they can earn respect and are therefore perceived as having referent power. But clearly you can manage and influence without authority. Where managers has no formal authority over the individuals, it could mean that they don't report to them, but nonetheless, they can still influence. So looking at the relevance to managing upwards and across to achieve desired results for improved supply chain management, what we're looking at here, of course, is the fact that when considering the term managing, we imagine a boss or a manager within their team. But managing is also about managing the boss. It could be about managing other people in the workplace. So the individual that effectively manages their boss can also achieve bonuses and promotions as they work smarter rather than harder. Some people wonder why the boss needs to be managed and perceive it as a manipulative for personal gain reason. And the reason for this view is that organisations were traditionally managed from the top down. But the term managing your boss or managing up isn't new. It first appeared in somewhere between the 1980s and 2005. Found that boss-manager relationships is important as one of mutual dependence. Boss need cooperation and reliability from their direct reports. And those are the reports that report to them directly. And then the procurement manager needs to manage across both east and west. Managing the east direction refers to other functions, and in the west towards supply chain. So the procurement manager also manages cross-functional networks involving formal and informal communication, where information is shared between colleagues from different functions. So in summary, managing in 4 directions means that a manager, project, lower or middle, must communicate with stakeholders, senior managers and key people in powerful positions to obtain support for a project. They need skills like communication, negotiation, team building, and getting users and staff to buy in to the success of a project. Now, in supply chain terms, escalation is viewed as a form of conflict resolution. In procurement, when a dispute arises, it's usually relating to contracts. The managers and other parties involved will not have been able to reach a solution. The manager will then escalate or move up to the senior manager to resolve it. And the advantage is that the senior manager will be able to take an objective view of the situation. But the time taken to escalate to the senior manager and trying to resolve the dispute will allow for any emotions between the original parties to be diffused. We're now going to look at a range of influencing styles for cross-functional leadership, both within and outside the bounds of formal teams. Now, a cross-functional team within an organisation is a group of people from different functions with their own knowledge and expertise, but they're all working towards a common goal. The function within the organisation might include finance, procurement, operations, sales, marketing, and they'll include employees from each of those departments at all levels. Cross-functional teams in supply chain management are teams of specialists, buyers and users who come together to improve or achieve an organisational objective. But in terms of formal and informal teams, before considering the influencing styles, it's useful to understand the difference between a formal and an informal team. Many people within the organisation belong to different teams. Some will be formal and others will be informal. So formal teams is the team created for a specific purpose. It has a leader and the individuals in the team have a distinct role. Whereas an informal team has no structure. The group come together often by chance, and that gives an opportunity for people to get together, have equal status, and there's no leader. They provide support. They're good for brainstorming and sharing ideas. So the procurement manager will need to understand team behaviour and the behaviour of individuals because it could be influenced by group norms. The norms are unspoken or unwritten rules that regulate how everyone behaves at work. Now, according to Belbin, a team needs the right mix of people in order to be effective. And Belbin clustered the 9 types of roles into 3 groups. You've got the doing and action group, the thinking, and the people and feeling groups. Each of these roles have, good contributions and allowable weaknesses, which we'll cover a little bit later. But Belbin also extended his research to the types of roles for leaders. He essentially said they're either a team leader or a solo leader. A team leader uses a more democratic style. They have recognised skills that individuals in the team respect, and they do allow diversity. Solo leaders are more autocratic, giving orders and directing teams, expecting them just to follow, which can be effective in some situations like urgency and the need for quick decision making, but leaders with an autocratic approach can have a negative impact on the team if they're micromanaging them. So what can a procurement manager do to influence individuals in diverse, complex and cross-functional team? Take time to cultivate reactions and relations. Successful managers devote time to these relationships with their colleagues. They get to know them, look at their points of view, explain and clarify what they need. Create a sense of belonging. So they create a kind of team that people feel devoted to. They understand different goals and roles and values and the approaches to work in different departments. They use negotiation to influence, and they influence the right people. But here you're seeing Cialdini's 6 principles. This author identified 6 factors that guide how an individual behaves when thinking about how they'll follow a decision or not, as the case may be. An ideal situation is when the individual is asked to agree with a request and they consider all available information before reaching an answer. But in reality, this doesn't happen. Sometimes there is very little information available, sometimes none, before someone can actually make that decision. So the principles is about reciprocation. This is about returning a favour. There's commitment and consistency, looking at the desire and pressure to appear to be consistent with what has been done, such as pressure caused an individual to respond in a way that justifies their decision. Social proof refers to peer pressure, and authority relates to agreeing with or following the individuals due to their title or position. And then liking, this relates to saying yes due to the decision maker being liked. So we're now going to look at the readiness of followers or groups. So the readiness of followers we looked at in Learning Outcome 1. It relates to that situational leadership style and depends on the situation and the individuals involved. So readiness is the extent to which a follower demonstrates ability and willingness to successfully complete a specific task. In order to assess the readiness, the leader or manager must understand and apply the 2 elements of situational leadership together. such as the ability to make distinctions between each of the followers and the ability of motivation, the ability to match what's going on with the followers with the most effective process. So the leader and manager assesses the followers on two areas and seeing whether they're high or low. So from an ability perspective, you're high if they've got a high level of ability and have the experience, knowledge and skills, but low would be little skills and aptitude. And motivation is whether or not they're highly motivated, confident, eager and willing versus hesitant, insecure and anxious. So to assess followers, leaders and managers need to have the ability to accurately observe their followers on the ability and motivation. There are assessment tools that can help with this process, such as problem solving tests or work simulation, or even personality tests and interviews. But an effective way of carrying out an assessment on followers is to communicate with them. Now, the attitude of a leader will impact positively or negatively on their people, their followers. Successful leaders always want to impact positively. But what attitudes work effectively? There are no limits to attitudes, but attitudes influence behaviour, and attitudes motivates are interlinked. It's vital when recruiting employees and future managers that an assessment of attitudes is undertaken. When considering attitudes, it's useful to understand the difference between attitudes, belief, and values. Attitudes is a set of way of thinking. It gives an individual a tendency to respond in a certain way. Beliefs are what we do with that. In a world and what is understood by the individual, and values are concerned with what should be. To be successful, a business organisation has three objectives: to survive, to grow and develop, and to make a profit. These three objectives are interlinked. Some researchers suggest that survival should be the first concern, as only after survival is ensured can managers work out a way they want to or need to go. There's more to consider than these three objectives, such as the range and quality of products and services, environmental influences, after-sales service, research and development, sales promotion, employment conditions, and so on. The reality is that managers are faced with many challenges, and some of these will be competing and conflicting objectives. So Drucker suggested 8 key areas where objectives should be established in order to show the performance and results. So the market position or market standing would be looking at market share and product range, distribution, pricing, customer loyalty and satisfaction. Innovation or development objectives would be about technological advancements, new processes and improvements. Productivity, best use of resources, a ratio of contributed value to total revenue. And resources would be the physical resource like equipment, plant, machinery, or financial resources like capital and budgets. Profitability, looking at forecasts, timescales, capital investment to measure profitability. Performance as a manager, deciding on jobs, roles and structures and developing future managers. Performance as an employee, employee relations, work conditions and unions. And lastly, public responsibility, the compliance with regulations and legislations, as well as corporate social responsibilities. But before deciding on KPIs, it's important to understand the difference between objectives, goals, and KPIs. The words are often used interchangeably and incorrectly. Different organisations and even departments within those organisations use goals and objectives to meet different things. And that can cause confusion in any organisation, as well as an employee who moves from one department to another, or even to a different organisation. Confusion can lead to difficulties. So the confusion between the word goals and objectives can be removed if it's agreed standard that everyone's involved and is clear on what it was. It's important to remember that there is a process that can be established to review and improve performance quantitative targets. They can be set, tracked, and reviewed and actioned. Your KPIs need to be SMART, which is an acronym that's used for setting goals and objectives. So S for specific, the goal objective should be simple, sensible, and significant. It needs to be measurable, should be meaningful, motivational, achievable or attainable. It needs to be relevant, so it has a reason and realistic, that you've got the sufficient resources to make it happen. And finally, it should have a time objective, a limit for when you need to carry it out by. We're now looking at the measures for effectiveness. And although chief execs and senior execs are interested in the vision and mission of an organisation, that will include excellence, innovation, sustainability, and relationship. The challenges they face is to recruit and retain appropriate human talent that align with the needs of the overall organisation. So investing in human capital is paramount to the success of an organisation. To measure the effectiveness of aspiring leaders, Cutler designed questionnaires that included all 6 areas in the jigsaw that you see on the screen. That was to be completed by their personnel, and the answers will identify if the individual has necessary skills to be a leader. So we need to see vision, we need motivation, example, empowerment, good relationships and communications. And some people who are responsible for leadership development say that it cannot and need not be measured. They say that it's enough to know that leadership development is working, and some invest in human capital and in developing leaders. They need to see a return on investment. Now, some readers may think that it's a rather odd topic for a leadership subject, I guess, to look at self-development and coaching, but the reasons for such thoughts are that there's unfortunately some leaders who believe and act as if they know it all, and therefore believe that there's no need for self-development. But this view is very wrong and damaging, not just for employees, but others around them, but also to the individual themselves. Developing and growing is done through learning. There was a good old-fashioned saying from Albert Einstein. He said, "Once you stop learning, you start dying." So we are going to consider some learning styles here. There's obviously different learning theories. You've got behavioural ones, classical conditioning, or the a conditioned response, and the law and effect, trial and error. With the behavioural one, it's sort of talking about psychology and behaviorism. It's where the approach where 2 responses are connected and repeated, and then the individual learns through habit. The classical conditioning one is the Pavlov dog theory, which you might have remembered from level 5, but this is showing you that there's a conditioned response with the power and strength of association. Then the law and effect, the trial and error. He watched this. This came from a writer called Thorndike. He watched animals in new situation and noted that they learned to adapt successfully to new environments, and that was through trial and error. But the cognitive approaches to learning is firstly the Kolb learning cycle, which is about reflective learning, experiential learning model. You learn by doing. A kind of constructivist model based on the concept of creating meaning from experience. And it's always used in management literature to its recognition that people learn in different ways, and there is no end to learning, so it keeps going round and round. An individual can move through the cycle more than once, even the one learning experience in the same for each learning experience. So you start with that kind of concreting experience, an experience you've made regarding your learning. Then the observation and reflecting is about what you thought about and experienced, and is it in relation to your learning? The forming of abstract concepts and generalization is how would you conceptualize your thoughts? And then testing these concepts in new situations is what impact does this newly achieved learning have on your future learning? So Cope identified, a number of learning styles, such as accommodating, the doing and feeling, the diverting, feeling and watching, the assimilating, watching and thinking, and the converging, the doing and thinking. Individuals may prefer one stage to another, and that indicates a preferred learning style. You've then got Honey and Mumford's learning styles. That was developed in 1992, and it's applied to managerial behaviour. It does use Kolb's learning cycle, but identified their own 4 learning styles with associated behaviour. Such as the activists, these individuals use the learning by doing. They involve themselves completely in the process, brainstorm, role play, problem solve. The theorists are using styles where the need for ideas has a specific end goal. They break it down, integrate and pull in new data, preferring statistics and background information that they can apply to their theory. The pragmatists are the types of individuals using a style that's put learning into practice. They take time to think about how to apply learning in real life, using situations, case studies, problem solving and discussions. And the reflectors are using styles by watching and thinking about what happened. They prefer being on the sidelines and watching from various viewpoints rather than, or gathering information and working towards a suitable solution. So they like discussions in pairs, self-analysis, personality questionnaires, observing and coaching, and feedback from others. And some of the other learning styles will be describing feelings, evaluating, analysing, concluding, and actions, which comes from Gibbs' reflective cycle. Now, before considering emotional intelligence, it's worthwhile considering intelligence in general. There are many different opinions with psychological disciplines as to the nature of intelligence, and theories that simplified intelligence was criticised for being too limiting and narrow. So Guilford suggested that intellectual ability requires individuals to think at more than 3 dimensions. Content, so thinking about the meaning of the words or numbers. Operation, to solve problems, recognise items and evaluate outcomes. And at the product level, thinking about the answers and outcomes. But great leaders possess emotional intelligence. They recognise and understand how emotions can impact on their leadership style and how others might perceive them. They accurately assess their own inner abilities and limits. They're important skills for managers to develop, and they're able to better know and understand their subordinates and the way in which subordinates relate and interact with each other. So an emotional intelligence skill or ability will be having sort of self-awareness, being able to manage your emotions, manage others, have empathy and motivation. Okay, let's now move on to communication methods and planning. So before considering stakeholder analysis, it is important to discuss communication and how to create an appropriate plan to influence stakeholders. Communication must be effective in order to influence others. It's also important for both parties to communicate and be active listeners. So the methods of communication can take many forms. It can be word of mouth, printed typed material like blogs or broadcasts, press releases, conferences, posters, flyers, brochures, presentations to suppliers or communities, or special events and open days that organisations hold. You need to think about planning the event. So as communication is the process of passing on ideas and information to others, it means expressing the true nature of the organisation the issues it must face, and its achievements. So the basic questions you'll ask yourself is, who does it need to be communicated to? Who needs to receive that comms? What needs to be in the communication? What method shall we use? And how will we actually distribute that communication? Then you identify your target audience using things like demographics, geography, employment, behavior, or attitudes. The content, think about the emotion. If you're trying to build a tone of positive communication, make sure it doesn't convey a negative message like legal action. The language, make sure it's in the language that suppliers are speaking. Use the channel of communication that will attract the audience, like those that listen to or watch particular webinars. Or looking at the resources like the equipment and the people. Anticipate emergencies, situations where someone might forget vital aspects. And then evaluate, which is an essential step in communication because it requires checking, reviewing, and evaluating to make sure that communication has been effective. So in terms of stakeholder analysis, this will include primary and secondary stakeholders, key stakeholders, and stakeholder maps. Decision makers need to identify which stakeholders have the most influence, to which expectations should they pay attention, and to what degree the expectations and influences of different stakeholders will vary. And decision makers are faced with the challenge because the number of stakeholders, especially in large organizations, and there may be conflict in expectations as well. A stakeholder is an individual group or other organization or business who has a legitimate interest in the activities or decisions taken by a business. And at this point, it's useful to look at the difference between a stakeholder and a shareholder. A stakeholder has interests, but doesn't necessarily own it, where a shareholder will own a part of the business. Your stakeholders could be internal, which are your primary stakeholders, members of your organization, those that engage directly in your transactions. They could be connected in some way, again, a primary stakeholder being a customer or a supplier, or a secondary stakeholder, which are your true externals, like the government and pressure groups and general society. And they'll all have different interests. And the model you use to manage your stakeholders is the Mendelow's mapping, which is on the right-hand side. That looks at how much power and interest each of these stakeholder groups have. And that's a visual representation of the relative importance of each stakeholder. High power, high interest are your key players. They should be managed closely. Low power, low interest are less important, only require minimal effort. High power, low interest, the stakeholder has just enough time and effort invested in them to keep them satisfied. They're likely to be the ones that have got some power, maybe a shareholder or something. And low power, high interest, they need to be kept adequately informed. So obviously you need to create a communication plan because you may very well have different communication strategies for these different groups. Now, having carried out your stakeholder analysis and undertaken a visual view of your stakeholders, you may have identified key stakeholders as those that are, needing more information. You should communicate with all your stakeholders, but in different ways. So for stakeholders who oppose plans, the organisation needs to get their buy-in to the supply chain strategy. So actions you need to take to get their buy-in is to understand the drivers of internal stakeholders. So ensure that they understand and have a good knowledge of the department's objectives and recognise and understand the drivers that create value. Establish what good looks like and ask the other departments what they consider is good. The second is to increase awareness of the procurement activities. And some organisations are not aware or don't adequately value what procurement does. And we don't just concentrate on cost savings, our activities are much broader than that. So to raise awareness, we should sort of identify things like risk, corporate social responsibility, and innovation. The third is improving engagement with stakeholders. We should meet with them, able to build relationships with them, and communicate in one-to-one or even in groups. And then finally, meet with the senior stakeholders, so you can align all your activities to the current strategy. And by meeting them, you're raising awareness of procurement. So stakeholder mapping has already been considered, but there are other types of stakeholder mapping and different views on how to map them. So we've looked at the simple Mendelow's power and interest matrix, but another one we could look at is the RACI stakeholder categorization matrix. So we're looking here at the roles and responsibility in relation to a task. So it shows who is responsible for the task, who is accountable, but also who you might need to consult and inform so that you don't forget somebody accidentally. And then the power and dynamicism matrix on the right-hand side. This is another stakeholder mapping tool that was developed by Gardner. The matrix looks at dynamic aspects of stakeholders. Instead of Mendelow's level of interest, the dynamic level is the extent to which stakeholders are open to change. It can be used in the same way as the power and interest for developing new strategies. So you could end up with a situation where stakeholders are powerful but predictable, with high power, low dynamicism. Or high is great danger of opportunities, low, fewer problems, and low power, high dynamism is unpredictable but manageable. Another perspective or view of stakeholder mapping was developed by Mitchell, and it's a so-called power legitimacy and urgency model. This is used to understand the priority and level of attention of stakeholders towards the organisation. It can also help to develop what method of communication you should use. So power is the power that a stakeholder has to influence the group. Legitimacy is the relationship the stakeholder has with the company. And urgency refers to the degree in which the stakeholder claims call for immediate action. The degree depends on time, how critical the relationship with the stakeholder is, and the importance of their claim. But as you can see, some of these will essentially overlap. So you'll have kind of dormant stakeholders. They have power but no legitimate or urgent claims. You'll have latent or discretionary stakeholders that have latent claims but no power to influence them, and it's not urgent. Demanding, they have urgent claims but they have no power or legitimacy. The dominant ones have power and legitimacy, so they have a strong influence in the project. The dangerous ones have power and urgent claims, but no legitimate claims. Dependent ones have lack of power, but have urgent and legitimate claims. And the definitive one in the middle, or the core, have the power, legitimacy, and urgent claims. So they're the ones that need regular communication. So a process for analysing stakeholder perceptions and expectations was proposed by Fletcher for the third sector and not-for-profit organisation. They have a wider, complex stakeholder group than private sector companies, so they need a model based on consensus for managing stakeholders. We've also got the Kraujek positioning matrix on the left-hand side. This model was about mapping supplier-buyer relationships to show the extent to which influencing approaches are appropriate to the purchasing aims of the organisation. And it ranges from collaborative to competitive, depending on things like risk and value. So you look at the profit impact and the supply risk, such as scarcity and monopolies and things like that. And essentially you'll have either leverage, strategic, non-critical or bottleneck suppliers. The strategic ones, high risk, high profit. These are the ones that need your most attention. Leverage, high profit, low risk. So use purchasing power to take advantage of competitive prices. The bottleneck are usually monopoly suppliers. So low profit, but high risk if they're not available. So you might overorder when it is available. And the non-critical is low profit, low risk, focus on functional efficiency and just monitor those. And then the Porter's Forces model on the right-hand side was developed by Michael Porter in 1979. It's a simple but powerful tool to understand the competitiveness of the business environment and to analyse stakeholders in the microenvironment. So when you understand the forces in the business or industry that can impact on profitability, then that creates and adjusts its strategy accordingly. So stakeholder mapping is an important research topic along with competitive advantage. And Porter's five forces model can be used by organisations to assess the power and influence of key stakeholders, which does include your customers, competitors, suppliers, new entrants and substitute products. And then finally, how to use intranet, extranet and internet for corporate websites and social media and publishing information. There are important differences between an intranet, an extranet and an internet. An intranet is a set of networked computers within an organisation, and it's private network where the computers are interlinked. The network can only be used by registered users within that organisation. An extranet is like an intranet, but with an external permit to control access to authorised external users. Extranets take the internet to another level by allowing permitted customers, vendors and partners or selected parties to access company intranet areas through a login and password. And the internet is global. Individuals and organisations can access information on the World Wide Web and stay interconnected. And a corporate website is the internet. You're allowing yourself to communicate with other people in the world, in the wider world around you. And some of those websites will have e-commerce websites like marketing and, being able to add things into a basket and check out. And others might focus their attentions on social media channels. So they put sort of messages out there or build media campaigns for raising awareness of their company. But organisations can use these tools to support communication with stakeholders. It's about being able to share and exchange information, like web conferencing, virtual meetings, emails, corporate websites, and shared access to online databases. And lastly, internet-based e-commerce and e-sourcing systems. But do remember there's always security risks involved with using the internet, but risks also arise when using intranets and extranets. So be vigilant, frequently monitor, and ensure that your antivirus software is up to date. And that's the end of Learning Outcome 2. Thank you for watching.